Hello, third graders. We're here today to talk about how the West expanded. We have been discussing how and exploring how the West began to grow, and one of the reasons that it began to grow so quickly was because of the gold rush. So, we're going to talk about how people traveled to this area in California as they went across from the eastern coast to the western coast. Let's get started. Off to the Golden Land. Settlers already in California began to arrive in the gold fields of Central California in the spring of 1848. The first gold seekers to arrive from outside of California were from other countries, not the United States. Transcontinental railroads and telegraph lines had not yet been established, so the news spread slowly across the country. Travel by land was very slow, and most news traveled by ship, and even that was slow. Ships first had to sail down the Pacific coast, around South America, then up the Atlantic coast of South America to the eastern United States. This could take 6 months. Ships traveling to Asia or South America could make the trip more quickly. So as a result, gold seekers from other countries began to arrive in California before people in the eastern United States had even heard that gold had been discovered. So basically what they're saying is here, if you were to look at a map, at the Atlantic Ocean, you have your eastern coast, which is right where we have New York, Florida, and that eastern coast area. They would have to travel all the way around South America, and then through the Pacific Ocean, they would reach the western coast, which is more where Washington, Oregon, and California now are. And so that was a long trip that took 6 months. So you can imagine how long it would take for this news or this information to have been received from western coast to eastern coast at that point in time. Now, Asia is across the Pacific Ocean, and so they're saying that the travel or the journey across the Pacific Ocean from the area of China would be much quicker and they would have gotten the news much quicker. And so you also have people that were coming from South America, Mexico, because of the fact that it was so close, they could travel there faster, and that would have made it easier for them to get there when they heard the news. So let's continue reading. When news finally reached the eastern United States, many didn't believe it. Then, on December 5th, 1848, almost a year after James Marshall first found gold, President James Polk announced to Congress that the stories were true. Now, if you notice in this, well, it's not a photo, but it's a drawing, it says this image likely created in early 1848 shows workers panning for gold. So it just gives you an idea of what it would have looked like at that point in time in 1848. Within days of President Polk's statement, gold fever swept through the eastern United States. That's around the area of like New York, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, that area on the eastern side of the United States. About 1,400 ships soon set sail from the eastern United States and Canada, bound for California. The trip down the Atlantic coast, around the tip of South America, and up the Pacific coast to California covered about 20,000 miles, or 32,000 kilometers. A shorter course combined water and land routes. People sailed south to the Isthmus of Panama, which is a strip of land about 50 miles wide that connects North and South America. They traveled by foot across the isthmus and then boarded another ship that took them north to California. So if you look at the map in your reading, right here, you can see that this little strip of land that is connecting North America and the continent of South America, that this little piece of land would have been more, would be easier or more quick to be able to cross as opposed to going all the way around the continent of South America. So people would have had to travel to that spot, unboard their ship that they traveled to or traveled with there, and then cross that little strip of land there, and then board another ship, and then sail up north to California. And so there were several different routes that people could have taken in order for them to reach California. Let's continue reading. Both routes were dangerous. For those traveling around South America, rough waters and strong winds could send ships off course toward Antarctica. Many travelers using the sea-land route, which is the isthmus, caught illnesses carried by mosquitoes when crossing through Panama's jungle. Some people died from these illnesses. And if you notice here, there's a timeline. So it gives us some idea on how long it took for the idea of James Marshall discovering gold to the point of time when people started traveling to California to find gold. So if you notice on the timeline, it starts with March 15th, 1848. The first printed story about Marshall's discovery of gold appears in a San Francisco newspaper. Then, 2 months later, on May 1848, the first large group of gold miners arrived at Sutter's Fort. Now, those may have been people that were already in the area working for other means at that point in time. Then in July, which is another 2 months, California's military governor tours California to confirm that there is gold in the region. In August, which is 1 month later, New York Herald, which is a newspaper, is the first major East Coast newspaper to report on gold in California. Then in December 5th of 1848, President James Polk announces to Congress that gold was found in California. And then in February, which is 2 months after that, in 1849, the first ship from the East Coast was carrying miners. They're arriving in the San Francisco Bay. So it almost took a complete year for people on the eastern coast to actually start to believe that there was actual gold and start to think about how they wanted to travel at that point in time. Now, if you look back at your map again, you will notice that under that is a caption, and it says in this 1849 map shows the different water routes from the eastern United States to California. The left side of this map shows the western United States, and it's showing with the if you notice, it's showing with the yellow arrow that California's gold region is right there towards the northern part of California. And I've shown it by pointing an arrow to it in the yellow, by using the yellow arrow. Okay, let's continue. Some hopeful gold seekers traveled across the country by land, earning the nickname overlanders. The overlanders traveled on the trails previous pioneers had mapped out before the gold rush. They usually joined other travelers to make the long journey with their belongings loaded into wagons and on the backs of their animals. Most overlanders took the Oregon Trail. It began in Independence, Missouri, and crossed over the plains through the Rocky Mountains and over deserts to the Pacific Northwest. Around Idaho or Wyoming, the overlanders split off onto the California Trail and continued on to California. Like the sea routes, the trip by land was a dangerous one. Once on the trail, travelers could depend on each other to stay alive. Any problem they faced, such as bad weather, illness, hunger, sickness of their animals, or broken wagons, had to be solved using the few resources that they had. Now, if you notice on the left side on page 16, it gives you a overlapping pair of circles. That overlapping pair of circles is called a Venn diagram. A Venn diagram helps you sort or organize information. So if you notice the title, it says Dangers of the Journey to California. And they're pointing out the dangers that people would have faced by sea on the left side, dangers people would have faced by land on the right side, and both of these ways of travel could have had these dangers that are in the center of the Venn diagram. So if you notice, by sea, the dangers would have been rough waters and ships blown off course toward Antarctica by strong winds. You don't want to be in Antarctica, especially in the winter time there, because it's going to be very, very cold. So that was where they wanted to make sure that they didn't end up. By land, wagons had to pass through mountain ranges and fast-moving rivers. They possibly could have had sick animals or broken wagons. So those are some of the dangers by land. And both ways of travel could have had very long journeys, bad weather, illnesses, food shortages, which means they didn't have much food, and illnesses being carried by mosquitoes. And at that point in time, they didn't have vaccines or any medications to really help solve those issues with cholera or diphtheria or any of these diseases that would have caused them to get really sick and caused them to pass away. So there were no medications at that point in time. On the right side, on page 17, you will notice that there is a picture or a drawn photo there of a gold seeker. And it says under there, gold seekers were often called 49ers. This referred to the year 1849, when they left everything behind to find their fortunes. So the 49er in this picture is meant to show how the overlanders often brought unnecessary items along on their journey to find gold. So if you're a San Francisco 49ers fan of the football team there, then you have now discovered why they call them the San Francisco 49ers, is because gold was discovered in 1849. Well, actually it's discovered in 1848, but people didn't start going to the area until 1849. So maybe a little something for your personal pleasure there. So
moving across the country was a difficult adventure for Americans of the mid-1800s. To reach the Pacific coast, emigrants had to journey across 2,000 miles of wilderness, braving exposure, difficult terrain, and uncertainty about what they might encounter along the way. These pioneers forged the Oregon Trail, which stretched from Missouri to present-day Oregon. Emigrants traveled primarily by covered wagons. Everything they owned had to fit into their wagon or be left behind. More importantly, the wagons had to hold enough provisions for the entire trip, as supply outposts were rare. Families were advised to bring more than 400 pounds of food for each adult. The journey lasted between 4 and 6 months. A typical day began at 6 a.m. with a breakfast of cold leftovers before the wagon train lined up and set out. A knowledgeable captain led the way, pacing the wagons to reach good pasture and water at noon and before sundown. The trail was rough, full of holes and rocks, so riding in a wagon was bumpy and uncomfortable. Most emigrants walked alongside instead, unless they were ill. Many settlers walked the full 2,000 miles of the trail. Wagon trains typically traveled 15 to 20 miles a day, less if they had to cross a mountain or a river. These crossings were time-consuming and dangerous. At river crossings, they could ford the river by using multiple teams of oxen to pull the wagon across, or they could caulk the wagon box, making it watertight, and float it across. Either way, they risked losing everything if the current swept away or overturned the wagon. At the end of the day, the wagons were circled to corral livestock, not to provide protection for Native Americans as often portrayed. The emigrants built campfires to cook meals and socialize. As timber was scarce, they often burned buffalo chips, which are dried buffalo droppings. They generally slept under their wagons or out in the open. Emigrants were at the mercy of the elements. Heavy rains created mud that slowed travel and flooded rivers. People also had to time their journey to make it through the western mountain ranges before the onset of heavy snows in autumn. The journey west was difficult and sometimes deadly. About 10% of the Oregon Trail's passengers died along the way. One of the biggest killers was disease, namely cholera, diphtheria, and dysentery. People also drowned at river crossings, fell under wagon wheels, and simply succumbed to exhaustion. Accidental shootings were also a concern, as many emigrants had little experience with guns. Violent incidents with Native Americans were less frequent than portrayed by popular culture. American Indians tended to help early travelers, either as guides or as trading partners. But as more and more white settlers flooded the trail, Native fears and hostilities grew. Over time, the weight of hundreds of wagons passing through the land created a visible trail. At the turn of the 21st century, more than 300 miles of these wheel ruts could still be seen.
On January 28, 1848, James Marshall discovered gold at John Sutter's lumber mill along the American River. By December 5th, President James K. Polk announced that the reports of gold in California were in fact true. Rumors of gold that was easy to find spread through the United States and the world. From the beginning, the gold rush was not as much a commitment as it was an adventure. In fact, gold seekers called themselves Argonauts after mythical Greek heroes. For Americans in the eastern United States, there were 3 routes to the gold fields: sailing by ship around Cape Horn, travel across the Isthmus of Panama, or take a wagon train across the United States. Before 1849, the Cape Horn route was the most traveled one. Argonauts traveled by ship south along the Atlantic coast of the United States, around the southern tip of South America, known as Cape Horn, and then into the Pacific Ocean. The ship would then sail north along the Pacific coast to San Francisco Bay, where the passengers would disembark. This was a long, dangerous journey of 18,000 nautical miles. It took 5 to 8 months to reach California and cost from $100 to $300. That would be equivalent to between $3,352 and $10,056 today. On the ship, they ate salt-preserved meats, fish, dried beans, rice, and potatoes. One of the recipes eaten was a hash made of salted meat, potatoes, and sea biscuits, which is dried bread softened with water. To flavor bad-tasting water, they added molasses, vinegar, and spices. In general, the food was awful. After a few weeks, the fresh food was gone. At the very southern tip of South America, Cape Horn is known as one of the stormiest, rockiest coastlines in the world. Winds were frigid and fierce around the Horn, and ships were often pulled far south toward the Antarctic. An experienced captain could shave weeks off the journey if he was skilled enough to take the Strait of Magellan and avoid cross-currents, riptides, sudden storms, craggy cliffs, and reefs. Another major problem the Argonauts faced was overcrowding. Greedy shipping agents would often sell more tickets than the ship could actually hold. For example, if a ship was supposed to carry only 100 passengers, the shipping agent might book as many as 200 passengers to make more money. Germs spread quickly through crowded ships. Sickness such as cholera killed many passengers and crew members. There was no way to fight cholera, and those that caught it died within 4 to 12 hours. Scurvy was another common ship disease, caused by a lack of vitamin C. If the ship's supply of fruits and vegetables ran out, then scurvy could become a problem and kill many passengers. Even though the journey by sea to San Francisco was a long and dangerous one, around 41,000 people traveled this route during the gold rush. Once the Argonauts reached California, they still had many struggles ahead of them. They would head to the dangerous fields in the footholds of the Sierra Nevada mountains to search for gold. Between 1848 and 1852, California's population grew from 14,000 to 223,000 as people came from all over the world in search of gold. Most did not become wealthy, but the discovery of gold in California led to it being ratified as a state in 1850. Many of the events surrounding the gold rush have had lasting effects on what California has become.
So we have been exploring how the West grew and changed as gold was discovered in California. Now that you've read and listened to the passage in the videos about gold seekers traveling to California and the dangers that they faced, now you are going to go into Schoology and answer the 4 questions about Off to the Golden Land. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to write me an email in your Schoology, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Have a happy Wednesday.